DNS, it's a pretty critical service on any network. And we've had some really dramatic DNS outages in recent years. And when that happens, we think about how can we avoid that? How can we make sure that DNS, which is really critical, both internal DNS but also external DNS, how can we make sure that DNS is more redundant? We have some technology in Micetro to support us there and to support our customers. But it's interesting to see when we take a look at like Fortune 500 companies and how they're doing DNS. And this is something we did recently. Took a look at all Fortune 500 companies and just queried them through like a DNS. So what kind of DNS setup do you have? And we see that most of them have a cloud DNS. So this would be Cloudflare, Route 33, Azure DNS, Akamai, a lot of Akamais, and so on. Then 28.5 are using their own DNS. So this would be Facebook and Apple and a lot of companies. And then on here we have a few which are actually with more like a maybe let's say hybrid approach. This one on-prem cloud is when you're hosting your own DNS server, but also are using Route 33 or Akamai. Multi-cloud would be, as the name suggests, between different cloud providers. And then hosted would be something with in a data center at the hosting provider. What's interesting about this is that these two here would provide what we would regard as enough redundancy, because you're using two totally distinct DNS providers. If one of them goes down, the other one is going to be available. And the likelihood of both not being available is fairly slim. Whereas the rest, both who are using their own, even though they have a pretty robust setup and network, they're still at risk that something happens on the network, not DNS necessarily, but something like a routing issue or something, and your DNS goes offline and you will be offline when that happens. The cloud providers are really robust. They have a really robust architecture and very resilient to failure. But we still have seen some failures, obviously, with them in recent years. And just a few examples of these large service outages. The Dyne is getting a bit old. So it is almost 7 years ago this October. But it was the first big outage with a provider that we thought would never go down. It would always be available. Just a massive DDoS attack on the service and brought down a lot of really popular services. But the other two, Cloudflare and the Meta, were on like a different story. That was not a DNS. It was not a DDoS. It was more like a router issue that caused these platforms to go offline. And what happens, if let's say that Meta, Facebook, had maybe, or not hosting their own DNS, but we may be using their own DNS and also a different provider, then what would have happened at this time would be that their DNS service would have gone down, but the other provider would still have been operational and up and running. So this is a number, a large number, but we just not sure actually the source, but this is what we figured out, that 3.5 million is the per hour outage of a website, a major e-commerce site. So it's a lot of money we're talking about, and we know that if DNS is slow, but that we get a bit frustrated going to a site if DNS is slow. But for obvious reasons, if DNS is not available, you can't go to the site and everything kind of collapses and you vanish from the network. So what we have done in Micetro to support our customers in gaining more redundancy is we have created something we refer to as XDNS. And I'm going to log into Micetro. And I'm going to pull into Micetro a cloud DNS provider, just so we can demonstrate how that is done, and also create this redundancy in Micetro, so your DNS is available at all times. So we have these services in Micetro now. So this is all on-prem. So we have Microsoft DNS DHCP, an IAC bind service, and also an IAC care server. I'm going to add a Microsoft Azure server. So, or a service rather. So when we do that, I do need to enter some information. Luckily, some of it is not really a secret, but you just close your eyes when I. And when we do this connect to Azure, it's going to pull in both the DNS, but also the IPAM information from Azure. Oopsie. Well, so I did something wrong with the copy. Oh dear, did someone spot that? Yeah, did someone read the error message? That's a good client secret. Okay. This look better. So Azure now has been added into Micetro, and if I go here and view the zones, you see that there are a few zones from Azure DNS in my environment. And just if I do a quick demo of the capabilities of the of DNS with a cloud provider like Azure, it is basically the same as managing an on-prem DNS, and that's a good thing because with the company which I call Micetro, and we are managing that with the tool. We have bind servers, we have Microsoft servers, we have also a cloud server, and we don't have to go into 3 different interfaces to make changes to the environment. And that's really solid. We can create, we can tie into the Active Directory users and groups and give them like granular access to the tool. But when they make a change in the tool, they all go into the familiar user interface when they make a change. So it's the same to create a DNS record on the Azure or create a zone on Azure as on Bind or on Microsoft DNS. But I did create here Tech Build Day, is it 17 or 27? That's a good question. And we have a small zone here with the on here, and I just can delete this record here just to show you how that's been done. And here's the DNS data on the in Micetro, and this is all replicated directly into Azure. So it has been updated now. Okay, back to the list. Creating a new zone is also really straightforward. With if I go here and say zone.com, and I can put it onto the Azure servers and into a resource group, and just go through the wizard next, finish, and the zone is created on Azure. I'm not going to go there because the focus of this is XDNS and the redundancy. So to help our customers overcome the complexity of keeping external, like 2 external providers in sync with DNS, we created something called XDNS. So the idea was that our customers showed interest in taking the primary zones, like the most critical zones, and saying, can we, for this zone, put it on AWS and also on so basically on Route 53, but also on Azure DNS. They know that these two servers or services, they're actually not really friendly to each other, so they don't use the native DNS protocols to talk to each other. You can't really set up like a primary, secondary. So there needs to be a way to keep them in sync. And this is something that we solved by creating the XDNS. So if I go into XDNS here and say, create a profile for my critical zones, we can, when there's a conflict, we can have either like have Micetro merge the conflicts, so it's going to be basically all records going to be in the resulting zone, or overwrite the existing ones. I put in the servers which are going to be in the group, so it's going to be these two. So this one is a Azure DNS server, and this one is the bind server, and we create the profile here. So now the profile has been created. What I can do now is go here and I can find the track field day zone. Apparently there's a slight confusion here with me whether it's 17 or 27. That's okay. Go here into this here and add to an XDNS profile. And what's going to happen is that the zone will be shared between these services. So basically, it's going to be shared between the Azure and also the DNS server, the bind server. So now, what has happened now is we have a zone which is now green on both the Azure and also on the bind server. So now we have created the zone on both servers. Micetro will take care of replicating the data between them. And also, when I created the profile, I specified how external changes should be handled. Because you can go into the console in AWS, and you can, or in Azure, and you can create a record there, a DNS record, or delete something. And we can specify, is this deletion going to be replicated to the other one or not? So it is. In fact, we can have one of them being almost like a secondary and the other one is primary. That's a use case with some of our customers. They say the on-prem DNS is the primary DNS. We only allow to make changes on the on-prem DNS. And if you go into the console in AWS or Azure and make changes there, we don't want them to be replicated into the on-prem. Now, this is it. So now for me to, we can see that it added the delegation here. So we see that the EDNS has been added again. So now the delegation is okay with the zone. So it's hosted on both Azure and on the bind server. And if I go here and create a new DNS record, and with find a range for this, 104 is free. Create and save. The DNS record has been now replicated both to Azure and to the bind server. And when, let's say that now some disaster happens and my data center goes down. So my bind server is in my data center, and it's like just goes offline. Also with Micetro, obviously. We can go then into the Azure portal. We can add records there. We can maintain records there. When Micetro becomes again available, it will do a synchronization like it always does. It will reach out to Azure and to the bind, figure out that Azure has more recent records, and will replicate them to the bind server. That's what happens always with Micetro as an overlay. It will always keep up to date. It's constantly synchronizing with the environment, and is like as an overlay. It's not authoritative. So if there's a change done outside the tool, it will be replicated into the tool, unless in this case, for example, if there is a rule that specifies that this should not be done. Any questions on this?
You talked a lot about products and setting it up. I'm kind of curious, what would happen is if you're in a situation where something new comes into play that you guys don't support, like a DNS, how would you implement that in Micetro? Is there a general catch-all?
That's a really good question. So there is a way now. So there's not a catch-all because they can be so different. Like for example, the difference between Azure, AWS, and also on-prem, it's huge. We can't use DNS, for example, to query a server for its zones, and we can sometimes query with a transfer to get the data from the zones, but not the which zones are on the server. So what we are doing now, we are developing a framework to more easily add services into Micetro, because what's happening is that the landscape is changing quite a bit. So when we started with Micetro a number of years ago, things were quite simple. It was like a bind and Microsoft DNS, maybe one or two other providers, and mostly on-prem and maybe some hosted. So now what we're seeing now, obviously, is that customers are using more services on the edge, or at the edge, and in the cloud. And we need to be able to support these different technologies, because DHCP, for example, is been more like a commoditized. So it's not necessarily today only on the domain controllers or on the microservers. It's on the routers, it's on the Meraki's or Palo Alto's or Fortinet or something. So we are building a framework which supports that this kind of expansion of the product. And the first service that we picked to do implementation of is auth-served by Akamai. So that's an on-prem DNS server, which is used by service providers and telcos. And the framework is used, and was the first implementation of the framework was to support auth-serve. But our goal is that it would take us 2 weeks to add a new service into Micetro using the new framework. So it's using the same functionality we're doing with in the UI. We're trying to abstract things as much as possible. We also do it in the API. But what we want to do as well is to abstract as much the support of these kind of new services.
I have a question about automation. I'm sure you support it, but do you have API calls? Because there's a lot of scripts out there, and Terraform, whatnot, to provision machines and reservations. So how are you on automation?
So I would like to answer this question by encouraging everyone to watch the next session, the next video. But it is absolutely, we have an API into Micetro, and with our API we try to abstract as much as possible. So through the API, if you need to create a zone, you don't have to understand the nitty-gritty details to create the zone. And we have a Terraform and Ansible plugin, which you can use to provision networks and DNS records and DHCP and so on.